Now here we are at Raby's Air-Cooled Technology in Cleveland, Georgia. Jake Raby, the owner of the business, is going to be taking us through a tear down and then step-by-step rebuild of the Type 4 engine. And we're going to be able to benefit from a lot of the things that he's learned along the way. He's going to be sharing a lot of helpful hints with us. Now he had a few things.
Ready to do it?
Yep. I think we're just about ready. You're all done over there. Before we get started here, Jake, why is it that you're such an advocate of the Type 4 motor?
They're really heavy duty. They're a more modernization of the Type 1 engine, and they're made to push a heavier vehicle down the road at a little bit faster speed.
Yeah. Well, when we tear this down, maybe you can show us some of the improvements that have been made in this engine over the Type 1 motor as we go through it.
Sure.
Okay, well, I'm kind of anxious to get into this thing. Where do we start?
Well, I always start by taking off all the sheet metal that surrounds the engine. Okay, now we're moving right along to the oil filler tube. And we have two different kind of pliers that you can use to remove the ring that holds it in place. And this is the type we're going to be using on our engine. It has the slots that hold the retaining ring in place while you're removing it. And then you can use regular pliers. And these are a good idea if you keep your fingers out of the way of the pliers, because a lot of times they'll snap on you and you've had a bad day. Compress the ring and then pull in the tube. Sometimes they're a lot harder to come off the engine. And there's a 7mm bolt with a small tab on the back side that clamps onto the cable. Remove your 7mm. Just loosen it up enough to remove the cable. And then have a friend remove it from the bottom. Hey, Rick, you want to tug on that for me real quick? Okay. There you go. Pulls out like so. Be sure to keep this in place. You don't want to lose this. Tighten it a little bit more so you don't lose track of it. While we're up here, we're going to go ahead and pop the top of the breather chimney off, like so. Cooling fan, and this one's a little bit different than what it is on a Type 1, because a Type 1 would normally have a pulley here with a place for a belt. After you remove the three 13mm bolts, which are actually special bolts, they have a different thread pitch than any of the bolts on the rest of the engine, you need to retain those. You can kind of give it a wiggle back and forth. This one's going to be a little bit of a bear to get off. Rick, you want to give me a hand?
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
When you get it out, you want to inspect it to see how many fins are broken. And this one actually looks like a keeper here. This one's in pretty good shape. A lot of times fins will get broken, and that alters the balance of the engine as well as the amount. Okay, once this 13mm bolt, this is actually a bolt and not a nut, once it is removed, there's nothing holding the fan housing in place. The fan housing is not that heavy, but it's kind of a bulky item. As you can see, it tried to pop loose there. So, Rick, if you want to grab your side, we'll just lift it straight off.
Okay.
And that's
there
it.
We go.
Okay, the piece of sheet metal Rick's holding. Okay, now we're down to the vital organs inside the engine. And we have the crankshaft here with the 4 connecting rods, just like a Type 1. And has almost the same bearings. The Type 4 bearings are a lot bigger in diameter, and the width is also just a little bit more. And the connecting rod bearings we'll get into in just a minute uses a couple of the same gears up here, and then it's a slightly different setup with a seal on the front. And then moving right along here, we have our camshaft. And this one was a hydraulic lifter engine, and it's showing a lot of wear on this number 1 lobe here, and that's what normally wears. You can usually judge the whole cam by this one lobe, but it's always really good to check them over. And I'd never reuse cams in Type 4s. Every time I've ever, still keeping in consideration that you're on the same number of rods. It's kind of easy to get confused. Line up your little alignment tang, snap the bearing into place like so. Now, I always like to take a little bit of carburetor cleaner or even starting fluid, works pretty good. Spray some on here and get off all the residue from the machine work. Okay, that was actually fairly simple. Okay, now you can always tell if it's in here completely by looking underneath the bearing. There should be no air gap between the bearing and the engine case. If there's any gap there at all, you need to start over. And this is very important, because if these dowels are out of a line, it's going to end up ruining the bearings. You've got to start all over again, but you won't know it till you get the other half of the case installed, which we'll be doing here in just a few minutes. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is be installing our cam bearings that hold them in place instead of these rivets. They hold their torque a little bit better that way. Okay, if you'll put your attention right here, you can see that we have one single dot. This is our old camshaft. Okay, that one single dot is at the 12 o'clock position when we're trying to get this indexed. And you'll notice that our slot that drives the oil pump is totally vertical here. Okay, now the way I align these, you look at your dot at 12 o'clock, and your rear lobe here on the camshaft should be pointing to the 6 o'clock position. Okay? You go to your new cam, it's going to be exactly the same. The new cam, like we said, has got bolts here. It's got threads inside of it instead of having the rivets. It's good to put it in a vise, the cam gear in a vise, almost like what we've done here, because it's kind of a tight fit to get this cam in. It's a lot of an interference fit from the back side. And when you put this on, you want to make sure your dot's facing to the outside so you can align it with those two dots on the crankshaft gear. Okay? Get it slid into position, making sure that the rear lobe is snap ring pliers, and install this into this outside portion of the piston. And the way you can see outside is there's an arrow here. And that arrow always needs to face toward the flywheel, just like it does on the Type 1 engine. So you can say opposite of the arrow is where you should install your first wrist pin retaining clip. Okay, what we're going to do next, we've pushed the piston just up enough to get the wrist pin by the top of the cylinder here. Okay, now that all those are installed, we're going to be going on to the installation of our rocker arm assemblies and adjusting our valves. Okay, now we're going to be ready to install our rocker arm assemblies, and these are different than a Type 1 because a Type 1 only has one rocker shaft that holds all the rocker arms on the entire cylinder head. These are divided in two, so there's twice as much attachment hardware and attachment points, and that makes it a lot tougher as far as being able to more evenly distribute the amount of force. Okay, there's two different kinds of the Type 4 rocker assemblies, and basically, well, there's three really if you think about it, because you'll see here we have a solid spacer, and these are using hydraulic engines. We use these more because they're better for performance. There's no spring here to break. There's just a little wavy washer. The other style has a longer spring that goes from the corner of one rocker to the other, and it lets the rocker arms move back and forth a little bit too much. And if the engine ever gets over-revved or something, that spring may break, or it'll let this move over. So what we do is we use our VW logo here on the valve cover as a good index. And we always want to have that facing down, and that's just something that I do, and mine never leak if I do it that way, even if I put them on dry sometimes and no type of silicone sealant or any Permatex or anything. And it's up to you what you use for sealant, but initially here I wouldn't use anything because you're just going to be taking it back off very shortly. So once again, our VW. Now we're going to be installing our fan housing. Rick, thanks a lot for bringing that over here.
Here, I'll hang on this end. If you want, I'll hang on this one piece of sheet metal here, too.
Okay. Well, you just kind of guide it up into place here. There's 4 studs we need to get lined up. Yes. It fits kind of tight. There we go. You've got to make sure that you clear all your sheet metal on the back side. One of ours was hanging up there. This stuff kind of fits like a jigsaw puzzle, and if you follow along here, we'll be able to show you the fastest way to do it. Okay, now we're going to be torquing our fan to the hub. Torque for this is 14 foot-pounds. Okay, now we're going to be installing our thermostat system here. If you remember, I told you to take this clip off when we disassembled the old engine, and now you want to put it back on the same way. I've already done mine here. It just like simply clips. So
we want to have the RPMs up pretty high.
Yeah, that's one big thing. Glad you reminded me of that. With these new cams, you want to run the engine at no less than 2,000 RPM for at least 20 minutes of the first break-in for the engine. That helps get the oil to the cam and lube those lobes up, and lifters as well, and it makes a huge difference in how long the engine's going to last in the end. It may not matter a day or two, but that's the difference between 100,000 or 150,000 miles.
Yeah.
So let's see what we've got here.
Well, again, Jake, thanks for having us up here. We really enjoyed it.
You're welcome.